As we come to the end of our final public hearing block, we want to reflect on what we've learnt. Australia has a proud military history steeped in the Anzac legend, forged in famous battles at Gallipoli on the Western Front in France, on the Kokoda track and elsewhere. Today, just under 60,000 Australians are enlisted in our Defence Force, and about 30,000 others are active reservists or part-time personnel. They pull on the uniforms of our Navy, Army and Air Force and go to work each day. At a time of heightened geopolitical risks regionally and indeed globally, in service of our nation, it's a unique sacrifice. The vast majority of those who serve in our military have a rewarding career and go on to successfully transition to civilian life. For many, though, that's not the case. In the last 3 years, we've learned much. Back in 2021, Defence told us that the suicide rate among serving members of the ADF was lower than among the general Australian population, and that serving in the ADF was a protective factor against suicide. In 2022, the Chief of Defence Force reiterated these points based on the evidence at the time. But this Royal Commission has looked at the issue independently and identified that, when looked at from different perspectives, Defence's prior understanding of the risk of suicide among currently serving ADF members does not necessarily hold true. For example, when we compared the suicide rate among currently serving ADF members with the employed population of Australia, our preliminary results found that males serving in the permanent forces are around 30% more likely to die by suicide. This is a new insight that must drive a new approach and new policies. Some veterans struggle to find their post-service identity in the civilian world or to secure gainful employment. Some find it difficult to make meaningful connections in their new community while no longer enjoying the ease of contact with their former Defence colleagues. Some suffer due to the permanent physical and mental health impacts from their service. And we've heard firsthand from serving members about the cultural issues and occupational stresses that influence their health and well-being, compounded by the barriers to help seeking, including the stigma around mental health and being seen as weak. All of the above can lead them to dark places in their mind, including to suicide and suicidality. At least 1,677 serving and ex-serving Australian Defence Force members who served on or after 1st of July 1985 died by suicide between 1997 and 2021. That's the official figure. However, we believe the true toll of preventable deaths to be upwards of 3,000. As we have said often, suicide in the military context is an extremely complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It's not just about mental health, although mental health issues often do play a role. Nor, as is widely assumed, is it always related to trauma experienced in the theatre of war, although this too can play a role. It's not a reflection of the character of the individual or indicative of some inherent deficit in their psyche or their moral framework. And lastly, while suicide may not be predictable in every individual, it must be seen as preventable. This Royal Commission spent the best part of 3 years now examining the cultural and systemic issues across the veteran ecosystem that are failing past and present personnel and which are contributing to this national crisis. It's been a mammoth task, which we have been privileged to undertake. Despite at least 57 related inquiries over the last 20 to 30 years and hundreds of recommendations, suicide rates have not improved. It's apparent that there has been a catastrophic failure of leadership at a government level and within military to prioritise the urgent reforms and implement effectively the previous recommendations required to deliver improved health and well-being outcomes for Defence personnel and veterans over decades. And despite all the rhetoric from those in positions of power about people being Defence's greatest assets, the senseless loss of life and the devastating impacts for families and loved ones continues to this day. This final public hearing block has had a clear and determined focus on leadership and accountability issues. We have sought to ask hard questions of senior ministers, the military's leadership and departmental heads about how we've got to where we are today and, most importantly, how we avoid making the same mistakes moving forward. It's been those with lived experience of suicide and suicidal behaviour who have bravely come forward and shared their stories with us at public hearings, in private sessions, and through written submissions. It is they who have enabled us to shine a bright light on the many complex cultural and systemic issues that are failing serving and ex-serving ADF members and their families. To them, on behalf of the nation, we say thank you. We see you, we hear you, and we salute you. We know many of our sailors, soldiers and aviators continue to do it tough, raising serious questions about what the ADF is doing to address the occupational stresses influencing the mental health and well-being of its people and their families, and whether it's working. We continue to hear troubling accounts of abuse, assault, bastardisation, bullying, discrimination, harassment, misogyny and physical and sexual violence within the ADF, all of which have considerable long-lasting impacts on victims. And then there's the strong adversarial culture and suboptimal practices within DVA that have caused hurt and distress to many veterans and their families when seeking to access their entitlements or much needed support services. Over the past 4 weeks, we've again heard heartbreaking and at times harrowing lived experience testimony from veterans and their loved ones about the challenges they have faced and how they've been let down by the systems that were supposed to be there to protect and support them. Dr. Karen Bird lost her son, Private Jesse Bird, to suicide in June 2017. Private Bird served Australia and Afghanistan and struggled with mental health issues upon his return to civilian life. Dr. Bird gave evidence that Jesse had submitted claims for assistance to DVA, but those claims were not actioned by the department. She fought back tears as she told the Royal Commission that Jesse's suicide was preventable because he had a really good family behind him, adding that malfeasance and maladministration had prevented her son receiving support in a timely manner. Jesse's claim for incapacity payments, which previously had gone missing for a year, was rejected in May 2017, a month before his death. Dr. Bird told us, and I quote, "That was probably the final straw for Jesse. I think he lost hope." She emphasised the need for DVA to start treating veterans like humans, not simply a file number. While we acknowledge recent significant efforts to improve within DVA, we could not agree more. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Paul Morgan gave evidence about an unacceptable behaviour complaint he lodged while serving in the Australian Army. Colonel Morgan's complaint involved details of a Facebook hate group designed to intimidate gay members of the Defence Force. He also received death threats and had threatening letters delivered to his home. He told us his superiors were, and I quote, legally bound, morally bound, to conduct a quick assessment within the first 24 hours of receiving an unacceptable behaviour complaint. It never happened, end quote. Australian Army veteran Penny Looker told the Royal Commission about multiple failures across the veteran ecosystem that left her feeling, and I quote, destroyed. Retired Sergeant Looker told us of the immense pressure in her workplace and the lack of support offered to her. She spoke of her reluctance to seek external support because she felt it would jeopardise her career in the Army, and how she was hounded by colleagues after suffering a stroke and while on medical leave. Instead of being supported to recover and return to work, Miss Looker was medically discharged. Her story also highlighted something we have heard from many veterans: the lack of adequate support provided by ex-service organisations, despite the funding they receive. Reflecting on her own experience seeking help, Ms. Looker told us that greater accountability is needed across Defence, DVA and ex-service organisations to ensure veterans are better protected and supported. She said, and I quote, "We need to make positive, effective change so that we do not keep losing veterans. To have issues that start in Defence, through DVA, and then into the ex-service organisation sector, it's just abhorrent. To have so many people hurting so much and have nowhere to turn, or the places we do turn do more damage, it's disgusting," end quote. She also reminded us, and I again quote, "Policy without accountability isn't worth anything." Some of these witnesses have waited many years to have their deeply personal stories heard. But make no mistake, while their cases might be historic, the cultural and systemic issues they uncover are contemporary. Former Navy clearance diver, John Armfield, gave evidence about his struggle to obtain information from Defence about the death by suicide of his younger brother, Royal Australian Air Force leading aircraftman Andrew Armfield. He spoke about what he called a two-tiered culture, with one set of rules for enlisted members and another for the officer class. Mr Armfield also gave evidence he was silenced when he called for Defence leadership to be held to account for the lack of care afforded to his brother. Mr Armfield's fight for justice for his brother ultimately cost him his career in the Navy, a career he loved. The way he was treated was appalling. And the most concerning thing is that these events have taken place while this Royal Commission has been on foot. We asked Mr Armfield what he hopes will come from his evidence before the inquiry. His response was clear, and I quote, "I don't want this to happen to anyone else. This has to stop. This is simply leadership. That is all it is." End quote. This Royal Commission knows strong, determined leadership at all levels of government, the military and the bureaucracy, and indeed greater accountability, will be required if we as a nation are to turn the tide on defence and veteran suicide. We've said previously that the first step to fixing a problem is to acknowledge a problem exists. We have already heard from the Secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs, Alison Frame, her acknowledgement of the problems within the department and her commitment to continue to move forward. So it's been heartening during this hearing block to hear from those in senior leadership positions within Defence, not only acknowledging that there is a problem, but owning it. Appearing before us, the Chiefs of Army, Navy and Air Force all recognise the link between service experience and negative and potentially tragic outcomes for veterans. The Chief of Air Force, Air Marshal Robert Chipman, conceded the ADF had been wrong to think there was not a link between service experience and suicide and suicidality. He said, and I quote, I think we now clearly understand the nexus between an individual's experience in service, particularly if they experience negative outcomes where they're involuntarily separated or they're a victim of unacceptable behaviour. If we don't address those issues while they're in service, then it leads to negative outcomes for them once they leave. So it is a service issue, end quote. The Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, cited this Royal Commission as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get a better outcome for service personnel and their families. He spoke of the importance of normalising mental health challenges while serving and acknowledged Defence needs to do better at managing those in its ranks who are experiencing mental health, and I quote, "We do put our people in challenging, risky environments and sometimes harrowing environments, and it leaves a mark. We do a good job of rehabilitating physical injuries. We've got to find a better way to rehabilitate and manage mental health injuries. Just automatic transition or leaning towards medical separation is not the answer. It should be the path of last resort." And Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, offered a genuine, heartfelt apology to everyone whom the Australian Army has let down. He said, and I quote, "As Chief of the Australian Army, I offer an unreserved and sincere apology to everyone whom we have failed. I want to thank you for your service and let you know that your courage will make a difference." General Stewart also sought to provide us an assurance about ownership of the problem while stressing the significance of this inquiry to the future of the Army, and I quote, "To the point that Commissioners are seeking an assurance about ownership, I can give you that assurance. I own this problem, we own this problem, and we are committed to doing something about it. There are 3 generational influences on today and the future of the Australian Army. One is the long shadow of Afghanistan. The other is our defence policy as articulated through the Strategic Review. And the third is this Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. The 3 service chiefs' acknowledgement and acceptance of the problem and their commitment to doing better is a significant step in the right direction. And it's particularly significant given that one of these men could potentially succeed General Angus Campbell as Chief of Defence. Appearing before us earlier today, General Campbell began by apologising for deficits in the care Defence has provided its people and pledging to do better. He told this Royal Commission, and I quote, "Our people deserve and should rightly expect the well-being, support and care that they need, both during and after their service. I acknowledge that this has not always been the case and has tragically led to the death by suicide of some of our people. I apologise unreservedly for these deficiencies. Defence is committed and I am committed to doing better." He also stated that Defence is profoundly reforming arrangements of its system so that cultural change moves from aspiration to lived reality, and reality that can be assured. General Campbell, whose tenure as Defence Force Chief expires in the coming months, was asked by counsel assisting what assurance he could give the Royal Commission that the person replacing him will lean into this issue in the same way that he says he has. And General Campbell told us, and again I quote, "My colleagues like me are committed to seeing this organisation function as an integrated whole and deliver for its people. The aspiration is that we live that expression, that our people are the most critical component of our capability and of our mission. And I see nothing but commitment for all of my colleagues, one of whom the government will consider to appoint as the next Chief of Defence Force. He or she indeed will have, I think, the complete support of the rest of the Defence and in particular the ADF leadership community." But serious questions do remain about the urgency with which Defence as a whole is responding to the deep-rooted cultural and systemic challenges which are contributing to suicide and suicidality. In oral evidence, Lieutenant General Natasha Fox acknowledged that unacceptable behaviour remains a systemic issue for the Defence Force and that, and I quote, "we have cases of unacceptable behaviour that we should not have." Further, Lieutenant General Fox accepted that those who experience unacceptable behaviour are at a much higher rate of psychological risk. One type of unacceptable behaviour explored in detail during this hearing is sexual misconduct, the consequences of which are known risks for suicide and suicidality. We heard the ADF does not know how many of its members have been convicted of sex crimes because it must rely on them self-reporting their convictions. It's also apparent the specialist unit set up to respond to sexual misconduct within the ADF, the Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response Office, or SEMPRO, is not appropriately resourced to understand the prevalence of the issue. In giving evidence, Associate Secretary of Defence Matt Yiannopoulos accepted that Defence do not have a reliable and integrated data set for sexual misconduct, and that without one, the ADF cannot effectively understand the extent of this issue. And if Defence can't demonstrate it has a handle on the extent of the issue, how can one trust it's seriously committed to stamping out sexual misconduct in its ranks? We also heard from Comcare, the regulator responsible for education, prevention and regulation of workplace health and safety for ADF members and Defence staff. Comcare agreed that leaders in Defence must be proactive in identifying and mitigating psychosocial risks. But Comcare is entirely reliant on Defence's own practices in identifying and disclosing psychosocial risks to Comcare, and these are still evolving. It was pleasing to hear, however, that there has been some acceleration in the standing up of the new Mental Health and Wellbeing branch within Defence, headed up by Brigadier Caitlin Langford. Brigadier Langford told us in Perth there would not be a mature, fully resourced and functioning branch until at least January 2025. However, she has given evidence at this hearing that the branch is now, I quote, "in a much healthier state with more than 40 staff employed." She acknowledged, and again I quote, "There is no question we have a problem and we need to get at this quickly, but it's how we corral the expertise. Once you've got the people, then you can start to understand how it functions and then what it might deliver for the enterprise, and that's going to take time." The final report of this Royal Commission, due to be handed down in September, will be a blueprint for the long overdue cultural and system-wide reforms required to deliver improved health and wellbeing outcomes for our serving and ex-serving ADF members and their families. Former Commander of Australia's Special Forces, retired Major General Jeffrey John Sengelman, described military suicide as a problem that would require a national undertaking to address. He spoke of the need for a centre of excellence to bring together researchers and thought leaders and turbocharge a unified effort and purpose to find better solutions to suicide and suicidality through collaboration. However, knowing what we know after almost 3 years of this Royal Commission, Mr. Sengelman made it clear to us that Defence should not be waiting to act. I quote, "This is urgent. This is a national priority. We don't need to ask the Australian people. They've already told us how important this is to them. We need to act as quickly as we can on this. The question is, how do we act the right way?" End quote. So what will it take for a large enterprise such as Defence to change? In his evidence, Associate Secretary Yiannopoulos acknowledged that Defence can be resistant to change. Commissioner Brown impressed on Associate Secretary of Defence Matt Yiannopoulos the need for clear articulation from the top down throughout Defence that suicide prevention is of the highest priority, up there with nuclear submarines and everything else. He stated, and I quote, "When we are trying to message where the enterprise is going, if our command all the way down does not echo and repeat it or amplify it, or worst, says, 'That's interesting, but we're not going to change,' then it's not the fault of the individual down at the working level. It's somewhere in that middle management that's decided, well, that's not going to apply for us." Secretary of Defence Greg Moriarty rejected a suggestion from Councillor Sisting that his department had a blind spot on veteran suicide until recent times, but stated the Afghanistan inquiry and other recent experiences have intensified Defence's focus on these issues. Mr Moriarty acknowledged his own views on veteran suicide were previously very simplistic and narrow, but had broadened during his time as Secretary. He told this Royal Commission that he sees mental health and well-being and culture as being inextricably linked, acknowledging poor culture can lead to adverse mental health and well-being outcomes for members. The Secretary did state that Defence could have done more to deal with the stigma attached to mental health, and I quote, "In the past there have been failures," and further, "Leaders at all levels should have been very conscious of the reality of stigma, why our members didn't want to come forward or present as needing help. There has been some real challenges for us in terms of dealing with stigma and making it acceptable for people to say, 'I've got an issue here.'" And finally, he stated, and again I quote, "We have let some of our own people down with appalling consequences." Of course, our focus is not only on the ADF and Defence. The cultural and systemic challenges within the Department of Veterans Affairs that have come to light during this Royal Commission are well documented and disturbing, to say the least. We welcome the significant progress made in response to our interim report recommendations towards simplifying the legislation governing veterans' entitlements. The Department has also publicly stated it has now cleared the enormous backlog of unprocessed claims. While we acknowledge this is a significant result, we note that this does not mean those claims have been determined. The Commission will be watching closely over coming months to see whether or not the 73,700 claims with a DVA officer as at the 29th of February this year are dealt with in a more timely manner, and whether their business as usual approach delivers faster decisions for veterans and their families, who historically have been driven to the brink and in some tragic cases beyond, while waiting years for their claims to be even looked at. Independent Senator Jackie Lambie has previously given evidence about her own battles with DVA for compensation after she was medically discharged from the Army with a back injury. At this hearing, Senator Lambie told us that her office has become the last port of call for many serving and ex-serving Defence members who are suffering. She stated that on average, 2 veterans every day reach out to her office for help, often because they feel unsupported by Defence, the DVA or ex-service organisations. Senator Lambie told us, and I quote, "Usually when a veteran comes to our office, they're on their last legs. If we don't do something, we will probably lose them." It's further evidence of the desperate circumstances many veterans and their families find themselves in due to a lack of timely access to appropriate support services. The scope of our inquiries covers a broad and complex landscape, including Commonwealth, state and territory governments, oversight bodies, as well as health, ex-service and other support organisations, among others. So, ministers responsible for veterans' issues in New South Wales, Queensland and the ACT used their appearance in this hearing block to call for greater use and sharing of data between jurisdictions to determine the location of veterans and their needs, and to inform possible improvements as to how veterans are treated in our healthcare system. We also recognise the role ex-service organisations have to play in tackling issues related to defence and veteran suicides. We're pleased to hear from a panel comprising representatives of a number of ex-service organisations, Young Veterans, Mates for Mates, Women Veterans Australia, RSL New South Wales and the Bravery Trust about their commitment to the establishment of a national peak body for ESOs to represent and advocate the needs of the sector, as well as veterans and their families. The path to better collaboration is clear and they are on it. As we have said, we acknowledge there is no quick fix to this national crisis. Success will take time and a concerted effort from both sides of politics. It's imperative that these issues are not politicised. We were pleased to hear from the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Defence, the Honourable Richard Marles MP, and the Minister for Veteran Affairs and Defence Personnel, the Honourable Matt Keogh MP, who gave evidence to this Royal Commission for the first time. It was particularly significant that the Deputy Prime Minister gave a commitment to make meaningful changes to address the issues that contribute to suicide in the military and veteran community. Minister Marles stated, and I quote, "We need to follow through and put in place the thrust of what this Commission recommends. We need to do that because that's what we need to do for veterans." Minister Keogh also acknowledged the need to better support defence families, telling us, and I quote, "Where the family's not happy, people will leave the Defence Force. So the better we can support families in service as well as families out of service, we will get better results for our Defence Force and its capability. We'll have better well-being for our serving personnel. We'll have better well-being for our veterans." So that's absolutely something that I think is a good thing and that we're committed to trying to do, end quote. We appreciate the size of the task ahead, but as the Deputy Prime Minister said, this needs to be a moment of change, and if a Royal Commission cannot be the catalyst for change, I'm not sure what can. We have known about mental ill health, suicide and suicidality linked to service since at least the First World War. Now that the defence hierarchy has accepted it's part of the problem, and it owes to its people, past and present, to prove to them that they are indeed its greatest asset and embrace the urgent reforms required to ensure their lifetime health and well-being. We commissioners are determined to deliver a final report with robust, evidence-based findings and practical recommendations to deliver real, meaningful and long-lasting improvements to the lives and livelihoods of serving and ex-serving ADF members and their families. Key to our success will be an enduring, powerful new body to hold government, the ADF, Defence, DVA and other relevant agencies, as well as state and territory governments, to account, to make sure they prioritise the major long-term and complex reforms that are required. As we've said before, this body must not only be independent, it must have the confidence of serving and ex-serving ADF members of all ranks and seek direct and significant input from them. It must be an oversight body. It cannot usurp the leadership of the ADF or Defence or DVA. It must not absolve that leadership of its primary responsibility for the well-being of Defence members and veterans. And it must have sufficient powers to deal with the issues it faces. During this hearing block, we commissioners engaged in a robust but informative discussion with members of the Afghanistan Inquiry Implementation Oversight Panel about the role such an oversight body might play in ensuring mistakes from the past are not repeated. We appreciated the insights provided by members of the panel, which was appointed by government to provide independent oversight and assurance of Defence's responses to the high-profile Brereton Inquiry. Professor Rufus Black acknowledged the dilemma this Royal Commission faces in finding a mechanism by which to ensure the enormous, deep and fundamental change, as he called it, that is required to be achieved. He told the hearing, and I quote, I think the question really is, what's the architecture that achieves that? This is about ensuring what's the deep systemic change that puts welfare at the core of a total system of accountability of which oversight can be important, end quote. Further, he added, sometimes oversight is important, not necessarily just because of what it can achieve, but because of what it stands for and the signal that it sends as a statement of values and about what's important. I think there can be a justification for oversight simply to send a signal that gives expression to Australian values, end quote. It's clear to us that the problems we're grappling with, a lack of public interest in and understanding of the issues, a level of distrust in Defence's ability and willingness to change, and the need to maintain a relentless focus on these issues once the Royal Commission ends. All of these warrant the standing up of an independent body to watch this space for the foreseeable future. We will provide a report to the Governor-General with a recommendation to Government about this new entity in June this year. At that time, we will also release a special publication honouring all those with lived experience who've contributed to our important work by sharing their powerful stories in 5,889 submissions, close to 750 private sessions, and through evidence at 12 public hearings. Accordingly, I'd like to take this opportunity to extend our deep and sincere thanks to everyone who courageously came forward and shared their experiences with us. This inquiry would not have been possible without your participation. Your courage has been inspiring. We will continue to work through the outstanding private sessions, supported by Assistant Commissioners Bob Atkinson and Dr. Susan Young, to ensure that those who ask to share their experiences with us have the opportunity to do so before the Royal Commission ends. I want to reiterate that we as a nation must do better to protect those who protect us. Australia has let down its veterans and their families for far too long. Far too many lives have already been lost. As I said at the National Press Club last year, no longer can we allow the preventable deaths of our finest to occur. And so I implore the media and public to maintain a keen interest in these issues and to demand action. We all owe it to our sailors, soldiers and aviators and their families to ensure they receive the protection and support they need and deserve. The Deputy Prime Minister asked that he be judged on his actions, and I quote, "What is actually going to matter is what you recommend and what we ultimately implement. History will be our judge," end quote. History will indeed judge those who are in a position to make a difference, and service members, veterans, their families and the future workforce of the ADF will be watching. Fixing the cultural and systemic issues we've identified will establish the ADF as an employer of choice at a time of geopolitical uncertainty, when our Navy, Army and Air Force need to be attracting the right people in right numbers. It will help stop the revolving door of employee turnover that poses a real risk to Australia's defence capability. We want to thank everyone who was engaged with the Royal Commission during this final public hearing and over the past few years. It's been a huge effort pulling this hearing block together, today marking our 101st day of hearings across Australia. I want to make special mention of those with lived experience who have followed this Royal Commission as we've visited cities and garrison towns across Australia, many who have attended our hearings at significant personal cost and time. We recognise how extraordinarily tough it is to be away from home and your support networks and to sit through the evidence we've been hearing. As we look around, we can see many familiar faces whose presence here demonstrate their commitment to this Royal Commission and what it seeks to achieve. We thank you all for your support. To our dedicated, hard-working team within the Royal Commission who've supported us on this journey, to those in the Commonwealth, state and territory government agencies who've assisted our important work, to the academic and research community who've provided tremendous insight on key issues, and to the mental health and suicide prevention sector, to the ex-service and other veteran support organisations who've engaged with us, and finally to the wider defence and veteran community, thank you for your support of this inquiry. Was absolutely appreciated and essential for our success. We'll continue to provide updates on our work through our usual channels in the lead up to our final report, which is due to the Governor-General by the 9th of September. Our next major event will be the ceremonial closing to be held at the State Library of New South Wales here in Sydney on the 28th of August. We will release more information about that event in due course. I want to leave you with a quote from Madame Arbour, the former Canadian Supreme Court Justice, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and former Chief Prosecutor in a number of prominent United Nations tribunals. She stated that her independent inquiry into the Canadian Armed Forces had, and I quote, "shed light on a deeply deficient culture fostered by a rigid and outdated structure that did little to modernise it. For all the hardship it has caused over decades, the attention that this issue has recently attracted presents opportunities for change that might have been unimaginable without such a shock to the system. We hope this Royal Commission has been the much-needed shock to the system and that it will inspire change required to address the national tragedy of defence and veteran suicide once and for all. For now, though, to those who are travelling, stay safe. Happy Easter to everyone, and we'll adjourn. Thank you.